Welcome to another episode of Musings at Thespace.ink. I'm Amrita Ghosh, and today we have with us Dr. Nicklas Hallen from Sweden. Dr. Hallen is a member of the research project African Street Literature and the Future of Literary Form at Uppsala University, and he's a senior lecturer at Karlstad University in Sweden. Welcome today.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about something that Dr. Hallen has undertaken during the ongoing lockdown in 2020, and it is called Notes from the Lockdown. Tell us something about this project and what was the main impetus behind this project?
Thank you. So I call it a fanzine. It's a kind of DIY collection of nonfiction, short fiction, poetry, some jokes, some photographs, and other kind of material that I think in one way or another speaks to the lockdown situation in Anglophone sub-Saharan Africa. It started, when the lockdown happened here in Sweden. I got sort of stuck in this very small apartment with my girlfriend and her kids. Started dealing with all of the stuff, that we have all dealt with this last 6 months. So when you're in that situation, like what you can do is basically work, hang out with the people around you. But then after that, you need to find things to do. So, and at the same time, I started to receive calls from my friends in places like Nairobi and Lagos and Johannesburg and so on. And I got the sense that they wanted to just check in on us in the global north and see how we were doing, basically, and I talked to some of my friends there, and they sort of, I got the sense that what they wanted to know is how we deal with the situation when everything is turned upside down and nothing is like it's should be, and all of the sort of support structures that we have here in Scandinavia, when none of that is working properly, And obviously they were dealing with similar things, but I think that their perspective was that a person like me is we rely much more on sort of infrastructure and kind of support networks around us, and that they are more sort of used to, my friends in Nairobi, for example, are much more used to just being in a situation where you have to just deal with what's going on, and you have to find your own way of getting through a crisis and so on. So I thought that was kind of interesting to feel that they were worried about us up here because, all of this sort of welfare protection system around us was not working anymore. And at the same time, I talked to some friends who are writers and poets and so on, who, especially in Kenya, who had gotten out. I mean, they traveled away from Nairobi just when the lockdown happened, and I got stuck in their sort of home villages with relatives and friends, and couldn't get back. So I talked to a pretty well-known Nairobi author. His name is Stanley Gazemba, who told me that he was in the countryside, got stuck there, couldn't keep working on his novel. So he was basically working in the fields with his relatives, And I thought that, or I asked him, are you writing something? And he said, no, there's, I can't do that up here. We don't have the electricity and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he was writing really interesting stuff on Facebook, just as updates about the situation. So I asked if I could use some of that material and put it in my little collection. And then I started sort of commissioning text from people, and also just asked if I could use things that people had already published in apps and Facebook, Twitter, and so on.
Thank you. You already have talked about the collection and the kinds of texts you have in the first edition. And my question was related to that. Are these all mainly fiction, nonfiction, poetry, as you said? And are they going to be the same in the subsequent following editions? And then why literature from the lockdown? What significant role does it play during this time? And also specifically in terms of gathering voices from, as you said, the Anglophone sub-Saharan Africa.
There is some text in Swahili in the first issue, but otherwise it's like you say, it's stuff in English because that's what I can work with. I'm teaching myself, or I'm taking a course in Swahili now, so I'm trying to work a little bit with Swahili, short Swahili texts. But otherwise, it's for practical purposes. I'm focusing on English literature, and I would say that it's. I think I have around 20 poems of different length, and then a couple of short stories or sort of flash fiction texts, but also some non-fiction, just people writing basically sort of a diary update from the time and place where they are. So I got a contribution from a man who's putting out a death metal fanzine in Botswana, who wrote about the impact of the COVID situation on the death metal community in Botswana. So I have that kind of text, are of course really interesting too. But I didn't want to limit the form to any specific kind of text. I was just interested in seeing what people, well, first of all, what they had to say and what they were thinking about, but also what kind of forms you get. If you don't limit the forms, like what is it that people are actually working on? Because I think one thing that happens, when society sort of closes down like it did, is that it gives people, it changes time in a way, right? Maybe we'll come back to that later, but at the very least you have a lot of time on your hands, and sort of that also gives you maybe opportunities to work on different kinds of forms than you normally do, So I just wanted to see what people would send me, and then I basically published most of the stuff that I got,
Thank you. I want to turn to the introduction. I've read the introduction and the first edition of this fascinating collection. And you mentioned that people were a little fascinated by the fact that the shoe was on the other foot. And I think you mentioned some of it at the beginning of our conversation. What did you exactly mean by that? And what kinds of reversals do you think happened in the West and the non-West beyond? Was it just the support networks that you mentioned about, or has it been other things that you noticed?
What I meant, I think, is that I'm not saying that the West was the impact of the COVID pandemic was worse in the West or the global North or anything like that, but I just got the sense from talking to people that they felt that people are more psychologically prepared to deal with a crisis, and that what happens when you rely on the kind of welfare structures that we have in the Scandinavian countries, for example, is that you give away some of the responsibility to someone else, which is a good thing, I think. But it also means that you will not necessarily be as psychologically prepared to deal with things. Don't have to necessarily work out these problems on your own, sort of psychologically, so to speak. So when I said that the shoe was on the other foot, I think that it changes a specific aspect of the global sort of relation between the global South and the global North, in the sense that this kind of entrenched narrative about Africa as this site of endless crisis and that kind of stuff. it changed that. So they, my friends who are not, most of them are not academics and so on, so they're not working on this kind of stuff themselves. They're just going through their lives. They're sort of small business owners and so on. They just took 5 minutes out of their day to call in and say, how are you doing? Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do for you? Let me know if, you need help with something or, and I just thought that was it became so obvious, that is something that I wouldn't necessarily expect someone from downtown Nairobi to call me in the morning and ask,
I want to turn in my next question to the circulation and the reception of your collection, of the first edition. What kinds of responses in terms of readership have you got from this project? Obviously, almost all the writers are from different places in Africa. And then this particular edition was also circulated in Sweden, I think in Stockholm. So what were the kinds of responses in terms of reception that you got?
Yeah, so the fanzine, it exists in 3 versions, you can say. There's one online PDF version, which is obviously free to download from wherever you happen to be in the world. Then there's a sort of a physical version in Stockholm that I printed here and that's sold in some shops in Stockholm, and that I sort of just hand out to people that I know. But then there's also a printed version in Nairobi. So I sent the PDF to someone in Nairobi who was willing to help me out and who sort of rearranged the layout a little bit and then printed it on a printing press and then gave it to a friend of mine who now has it in the trunk of his car. So it's basically going around in Nairobi and gives it to people. And the response has been great. It's been downloaded I haven't kept up with the statistics, but it's been downloaded, many more times than I would expected it to be. I don't know. I think we're running out of physical sort of copies in Nairobi. I have a bunch here, but it's been really, really good. And I think in Africa, I haven't really talked to people who have bought it, but I talked to the authors and contributors, of course, and they say that people have been interested in getting copies. But what keeps being mentioned is the sort of Pan-Africanness of the text. Not ideologically, but the fact that it's from all over Africa. So the contributors themselves have said that what they think was the most interesting aspect of it is to see how similarities and differences between how people write about it and think about it and conceptualize the pandemic in different parts of Anglophone Africa. And here in Stockholm and in Sweden and in the West in general, people have, they've been really interested in it. I think it's kind of the DIY-ness of the text that makes it appealing to some people. That it's a little bit punk rock in a sense, and not that it's not super academic. And interestingly, especially academics seem to like that.
Yes, absolutely. I really enjoyed it too. I think you mentioned before about the concept of time, and I have been really interested again in your introduction and the way you have talked about phone calls and the concern that you received from many of your friends. And it seems that the imagination of time has also been affected by the pandemic and the idea of a lockdown, that the virus first spread from faraway China, slowly to Europe, then towards other places and spaces. How do you think time has been imagined or reconfigured or restructured by the lockdown and through the writings that you curated?
So most of the texts that I collected had been written before or were written in sort of late May and June. So that was pretty early on in this lockdown period, and a lot has happened since then. So back then I think people were just struggling to sort of make sense of what this meant here and now, and how long this was going to go on for, and I think that people felt that for now it's, of course it's a crisis and people are dying, but we're fine for now, but who knows, what, where we'll be in a couple of months, But then recently, me and my good friend Mike Frangos, who is a lecturer at Linnaeus University in Sweden, we have sort of organized a comic competition together with Comic Republic in Lagos, Nigeria. And as part of that competition, we want to turn the short list of contributions into the next issue of Notes from the Lockdown. And in that material, people use sort of Afrofuturism and superhero narratives, and that kind of sort of more speculative type of narrative to think about things like time loops and more sort of sci-fi and fantasy allegorical narratives about being in lockdown, So there's an interesting, the runner-up in that competition was a comic about a person who is just sitting at home in lockdown, and things are not going so great. It's super boring. It's not that it doesn't really emphasize the sort of the critical. It's not about people dying and that kind of stuff, or not having access to food or so on. It's just more like boredom, and the person is just sitting at home and nothing is happening. And then all of a sudden there's this moment where that person realizes that is just sort of this kind of matrix sort of projection of a reality. And that what's actually happening is that the Earth has been sort of attacked by these sort of alien type figures. And now when the comic ends, the protagonist sort of becomes part of this resistance against this sort of alien attack, which is explicitly connected with the corona pandemic, But so what has happened then is that everyone is in this kind of sci-fi time loop. Every day is the same, and this kind of Groundhog Day narrative, And I think that's fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating comment on, and also sort of on almost on a like, it's almost on. It's kind of funny, right? In a way, I think it's meant to be both funny and a more philosophical sort of comment on that, Yeah.
Thank you. I want to turn to the title that you have selected for this project, Notes from the Lockdown. And the lockdown itself has come to mean various different things pertaining to where one belongs. Either stark images of inequality, or even a collective solidarity to stop the virus from spreading against this liberal individual responsibility. Or as you mentioned, people's employments have stopped. In the introduction, you talk about people, and you mentioned a certain writer who stopped writing and started working in the fields. What does the lockdown represent, or how has it been represented in the various writings? And I know that you've mentioned a couple of these instances, but if you could emphasize a little more about the notion or the concept of the lockdown and how it has been represented in the writings.
I think one thing is that is kind of vaguely associated with narratives of colonization and sort of invasion and that kind of stuff, which I suppose is kind of makes sense, that it comes from the outside, and that it's this sort of crisis within the community that needs to be explained and processed on a sort of collective level, you know. And one thing is interesting in this kind of material, and I've seen that before in my own research on similar types of writing, but before the Corona lockdown, and that's the fact that in a lot of this stuff, and some of these texts are written by amateur writers, you know, people who might not necessarily have the opportunity to read world literature and sort of recent African novels and that kind of stuff, but who are much closer to some kind of popular culture. There's a tendency in that material to speak to the reader in the capacity of someone, sort of a person of letters, so to speak, but about something that people are anxious about or sort of worry about. But so the point is not that you give someone information about something, but because you get your information from the same place as everyone else, you know. Everyone around you is sort of locked into this general sort of news cycle, and they get the, you know, information from the same sources as everyone else. So what people actually offer the reader is to process that in the form of, you know, sort of literary texts, you know. So you give them the same information. You're not speaking as an expert or as someone who has more information than anyone else, but you're speaking as someone who can rearrange it and give it back to you in the form of literature, whatever that means. It might be poetry or, you know, but it's more sort of, I get the impression that what you're sort of saying to your reader is that I have an artistic talent and I have sort of rhetorical skills that allow me to sort of do a retake, you know, to process this information again and give it back to you, so you can sort of yourself sort of sit with it and see it in a new way, you know. And you see that also in sort of pamphlets that address people who are interested in to know this kind of self-help inspirational literature that people read, that is about how you become successful in the sort of informal economy in big African cities like Nairobi and Lagos, you know. So the people who write that stuff, they haven't really figured out, like no one has, including, you know, Western academics and so on. No one can tell you what you need to do to be successful in that sort of environment of extreme competition. But you get something out of reading about it, reading sort of literary texts about it, you know. And I think that there's something really, really interesting in that, you know.
Absolutely.
So, for the second part of your question, so can you repeat the second part?
I think you did really cover both questions. And pardon the sound, it's classic pandemic Zoom interview when construction might come in. I want to follow up one final sort of the subsidiary question. And, you know, we both know there are enough complexities in representation and how one represents. And your project has this fascinating intersection of the global North and the South. So are there eventual editions where there would be some kind of a comparative notes from the lockdown from the global North or even Scandinavia that you would be planning to see some kind of an intersectional understanding?
That would be very interesting. I haven't really thought about it in terms of sort of content, But what I want to do is to involve more people, to make sort of illustrations and contribute to the layout and to commission text and so on. But it's not meant to be like sort of a series of text where I curate African literature. It's just a way of sort of archiving, if you like, in a very sort of modest and not very academic sense, writing that is already there but would otherwise sort of disappear because it's ephemeral and you know, it's not really meant to last, you know. And it's also a way of sort of making an intervention into sort of the circulation of sort of these kind of popular sort of everyday type texts, you know. But that also means that you know, there's not so much. I'm not so interested. I wouldn't be very interested in like getting contributions from actual sort of established writers in the global north, but maybe from sort of similar things, like, you know, sort of just looking around on Facebook and find connections to this kind of material and include stuff that people write about as Facebook updates or on Twitter or blogs and that kind of stuff. So yeah, maybe. But also, like I said, I want to involve as many people as possible, both in the global north and the global south, and see what happens organically when more people are involved, you know.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. And if you could please tell the viewers where to download this, where to find this collection, absolutely fascinating, and also the eventual ones that are coming out.
You can get it at my blog called African Street Literature. It's at WordPress. So if you Google that, you will probably find the blog, and then you should be able to download the first issue, the comic issue, and any future issue from that.
Thank you. And we will also be tagging the issue underneath our interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Hallen.
Thank you. Thank you.